Good morning, all.
Good morning,
Good
ma'am.
morning, miss.
Good morning, Miss.
Good morning.
Good morning, miss.
Good morning. Today we'll be starting with Module 2 or your Unit 2 in your syllabus, which deals with nuclear models and nuclear decay. In the first module, we discussed various properties of the nucleus, and we also saw a very simple system called deuteron. And we found out various properties of nuclear forces also by studying the system deuteron and also through scattering experiments between neutron and proton. And we also proposed a model for the sort of interaction that happens between nucleons, and that is called the exchange force model. These were the contents in Unit 1. And in Unit 2, we will be coming across various nuclear models available. The important ones are nuclear shell model and liquid drop model. A portion of liquid drop model was uh, dealt with in the first module, where we studied the expression for semi-empirical mass formula. Actually, there are five terms in the semi-empirical mass formula, where three terms come from the liquid drop model and two terms actually are related to shell model. So, a bit of this module has been dealt with in the previous, along with the previous unit. So, we will just progress to shell model first, and then we will go to liquid drop model. So, before we start with any nuclear model, we should understand that before we propose any nuclear model, the nuclear model that we are proposing, whatever model we are proposing, that model should be able to explain the properties that are obtained from experiments. Okay, so all nuclear models should be able to explain results from experiments. And the proposed models should also be able to make some predictions which we should be able to obtain via experiments. That is, there are many things in physics where the theory comes first and experimental proofs come later. One such thing is the hypothesis of matter waves by de Broglie. When de Broglie proposed that, it was just a hypothesis. But later on, when Davison and Germer performed the experiments on electron diffraction, then only the concept of matter waves was proved. So, similarly, any model that we are proposing, that should be able to explain the results obtained from experiments done till then, and it should also be able to make some predictions about the different uh, properties of nucleus, which we should be able to uh, validate by doing some experiments. So it should be able to make some predictions which should be verifiable by experiments. Okay. So whenever we propose some model, we should keep this in mind. So till then, one of the successful models, uh, okay, when we are proposing a model in some branch of physics, we can actually take results from some other branch of physics. The successful model that was available then was the atomic shell structure, where electrons in an atom were supposedly arranged in shells named like K shell, L shell, M shell, etc. This we have studied either in your plus 2 chemistry course or in atomic spectroscopy itself. You might have come across such an arrangement of electrons within atoms. Okay. And in this arrangement, you see that each shell can accommodate a maximum of these many number of electrons. See, your K shell will accommodate 2, L shell can accommodate 8, etc. So there are a fixed number of electrons that each shell can accommodate, and that is given by 2n square. Okay, your n equal to 1 for K, so it can accommodate 2 electrons. N equal to 2 for L, it can accommodate 2 into 2 square, which becomes 8. Similarly, you can find the number of electrons which can be accommodated, the maximum number of electrons which can be accommodated by any shell. And you see that in the process of arranging electrons, Pauli exclusion principle is obeyed and filling takes place in accordance with Pauli exclusion principle. Okay. And apart from this, you see that there are, not every atom has these many number of electrons. Say hydrogen atom, it contains only one electron. So the K shell is not completely filled, it is half filled. But when it comes to helium, it has two electrons and K shell is completely filled. So there are occasions where you find some shells to be completely filled, and maybe in the case of, say, sodium, it has 11 electrons. So when you do the filling, the K shell is completely filled, L shell also becomes completely filled, and you are left with one electron which is filled in M shell. Okay. So during the course of filling, you come across some completely filled shells, and you are left with a few valence electrons which are accommodated in the outer inner shell, which we call the outermost shell. And those electrons are called the valence electrons. And the valence electrons actually decide the properties of the particular element. That is what we have studied in the case of atomic physics. Okay. And here I have drawn two graphs, or not I have drawn, I have just placed two graphs which have been obtained from experiments. This is for the case of atoms. Okay. We have not started dealing with the nuclear shell model. As of now, I am just showing you results that we have obtained in the case of atoms, and we will use these assumptions or these type of modeling for nuclei also. So before that, we will just see what we have obtained in the case of atoms, and we would like to see whether we will obtain similar sort of behavior in the case of nuclei also. So in the first graph, the plot is between atomic radius on the y-axis and atomic number on the x-axis. Okay, so on your x-axis you have Z, which is the atomic number. Atomic number means the number of electrons or number of protons within the atom. And on the y-axis you have atomic radius. So if you see, the general pattern of the plot is like this. It starts from a particular value, and as atomic number progresses, and when atomic number reaches the value 8, it has not reached 10. Yeah, okay. It has reached 10. Okay, it has reached 10. When it reaches the value 10, you see that it is a minimum. Then again, when it goes to the value 11, it shoots up, and from there it again gradually decreases, and when it reaches the value 18, I suppose. Yeah. Then again it reaches a minimum. Then again it starts from a high value and it goes to a minimum. So this is the general trend of the graph. Okay. And you see that in general, the atomic radii is increasing, isn't it? It is not the not the value that you see for this particular number of electrons. Radius has a particular value for this number of electrons, but when number of electrons increases, we see that atomic radii also have an increasing trend. Okay, all these things are obvious from the graph. So these are expected things. Why? Because see, in a case where you have two electrons, I need only the first shell to occupy those two electrons. But in the case where I have, say, 10 electrons, I need the first two shells, isn't it? Say, apart from the nucleus, I have two shells of two shells containing electrons. So here I have the remaining 8 electrons being filled. The radius of this atom will be smaller than radius of this one, isn't it? Because here there are more number of electrons to be accommodated. So more space is required to accommodate the larger number of electrons. And this you can expect as you progress with higher number of electrons. So the increase in atomic radius is justified. That is what we have seen here. See, the increase in atomic radius with increase in the number of electrons can be expected. And within a shell, we see that uh, when we start filling a shell, the radius is actually large, and as we fill more and more number of electrons within that shell, and when it is reaching shell closure, actually the radius falls. Then again, when a new shell starts, the radius shoots to a high value, and again it falls and reaches a minimum at shell closure. So these 2p, 3p, etc., 3d, etc., what they have indicated are locations of shell closures. When I say shell closure, I mean shell closure. I mean, if there is a possibility to accommodate 8 electrons here, when all the 8 electrons have been accommodated in this shell, I say that that shell is closed. Now it cannot accommodate another extra electron. So these are locations of shell closures. When a shell is accommodated with the maximum number of electrons that it can hold, then it is said to be closed. And at locations of shell closures, you see that the radius is a minimum. Then again, when the new shell opens for filling, the radius is large, and at locations of shell closure, the radius happens to be a minimum. So this is the general trend that we observe with the graph. So at locations of shell closures, actually there is a drastic variation in the property. Atomic radius happens to be a minimum. Then after this point, the radius shoots to a maximum value. Again, it goes to a minimum at shell closure. Then after this point, again a maximum. So the variation in this property called atomic radius is actually drastic at locations of shell closure. Okay, I hope this much is evident from the graph. Now if we go to another property called ionization energy. Now what is ionization energy? Ionization energy is the energy that you have to supply to the atom in order to ionize the atom. Ionize the atom means in order to remove an electron from that, you have to supply this much amount of energy. Now you tell me if it is easy to remove an electron from a completely closed shell or a shell with lesser number of electrons. Is it easier to remove electrons from such a shell Is it easier to remove electrons from this shell or this one? Which is more easier? Someone please tell. Is it easier to remove electrons from a completely closed configuration, or is it easier to remove an electron from a non-closed configuration? Which one is easier?
Non-closed configuration.
Yes, because these are actually very stable configurations and it is very difficult to remove an electron from such closed configurations. And these type of completely filled shells are observed in elements which we generally classify as inert gases. Okay, they are called inert because they don't participate in any reactions. They are not reactive only because of this factor that their shells are completely closed. But other elements, they have either one or two electrons in the outermost shell, or they are just short of one or two electrons in the outermost shell, and they generally are more prone to participate in reactions. But such closed configurations are really stable configurations, and it is very difficult to remove an electron from such a configuration. So for this, you will have to supply extremely large amount of energy when you compare with this system. And it will be even more easier if your L shell contains only one electron. It is very easy to remove this one electron. It will be more difficult when there are two electrons. It will get even more difficult when there are three electrons. And the difficulty level actually increases as the uh, shell approaches shell closure. Okay, so what do you expect in a graph? In a graph, you expect that at positions of shell closures, the ionization energy will be extremely large and it will actually gradually decrease and it will be a minimum for the configuration I showed here with just one electron. Just before I had drawn a configuration with just one electron. One such example is lithium, which contains three electrons. And when you fill, K shell will be completely filled with two electrons and L will contain only one electron. So the easiest uh, thing is to remove this one electron from this L shell. It is more difficult when it comes to the next case, helium, which contains four electrons. Then K equal to 2 and L equal to 2. So to remove one electron from this, it will be slightly more difficult than removing an electron from lithium. So we will have to supply little bit more amount of energy. Then when it comes to boron, which has 5 electrons, it will be slightly more difficult because there are 3 electrons here and it will be a little bit more difficult to remove. You will have to supply a little bit more amount of energy. And as you progress and as you reach neon, which contains 10 electrons, your K shell will contain 2, L will contain 8 electrons. It's completely closed configuration. And we the toughest to remove the electron from L equal to 8. But when you go to the next element, it will be easier. For sodium, you have 11 electrons and it will be very easy. So you need to supply only a small amount of energy. So in the graph, you expect such variations and that variation can be observed here in the graph of ionization energy versus atomic number. You see that ionization energy is maximum for locations of shell closures. Helium, 2 electrons, K shell is closed. Neon, 10 electrons, L shell is closed. Argon, M shell is closed, etc. And as you progress, you will see that at locations of all the inert gases, you see that ionization energy is maximum. Okay. So And immediately following shell closures, you see that ionization energy drops to a very low value because it is very easy to remove electrons from one electron systems like lithium, sodium, potassium, etc. So at locations of shell closures, you see that there are drastic variation in properties such as atomic radius and ionization energy. And there is an interesting thing about this graph. You will see that this graph is actually a mirror of this one. Wherever here a maximum occurs, in this graph, it will be a minimum point. You can see that here a maximum is occurring in the case of atomic radius. Here it is a location of minimum. Here a minimum is occurring in the case of atomic radius, and that's the location of maximum. So these graphs are actually mirror of each other. Even though visibly you might not be seeing such a pattern because you will be seeing some differences over here, but that's not the issue. Wherever a maximum is occurring in the case of ionization energy, the radius will be a minimum here. You can see such a trend, such a behavior in both of these graphs. So if we try to extend this sort of a modeling in the case of nucleus, there are actually some troubles in extending such a modeling. One such problem in extending such a model for a nucleus is that there is a slight difference between a nucleus and an atom. In the case of an atom, the electrons are assumed to move in a potential that is offered by the Coulombic field of the nucleus. You have an external body called nucleus to supply some form of potential in which the electrons are assumed to be moving. But in the case of a nucleus, the nucleus itself is a single entity where you have several nucleons within the nucleus, and you are trying to uh, extend this sort of a model for a nucleus. Here there is no external body to supply a potential and all. The difference in assumption is the nucleons themselves. In the case of a nucleus, there are several nucleons. There are protons, there are neutrons, and each nucleon is moving in a potential which is offered by all the other nucleons. This is same that is the assumption that we make here. In the case of an atom, the electrons are moving in a potential which is offered by an external body, the nucleus. But here within the nucleus, there are several nucleons, and each nucleon is moving in the potential offered by the rest of the nucleons. This is true for all the nucleons. Okay, so that is one of the difference in assumptions here. Then there is a problem like in the case of an electron, you had a concept called spatial quantization of orbits, and that was very helpful um, in solving the problem that electrons do not collide with each other during their motion. But here in the case of nucleons, you cannot think of something like spatial quantization of orbits within the nucleus. That concept is not possible to be extended from the atomic realm to the nuclear realm. There are some problems when we try to extend the same concepts here, but there are certain observations which strongly suggest that nucleons too are arranged in shells within the nucleus. There are certain experimental evidences which are proofs for the fact that such a model need not be discarded. In the case of nucleus also, you can come up with such a model as we had for the atom. So, what are the experimental evidences which suggest that shell model can be extended to the nucleus also? One such experimental observation is given in a graph here. Here, uh, these are actually two different data values. Here I have the proton separation energies given here. I am taking nuclei with constant n, and that is isotones. I am taking some isotones, and I am plotting the proton separation energies for various isotones. Okay. Now, what is meant by proton separation energy? It is similar to the ionization energy that we saw just before. Proton separation energy is the energy you have to supply in order to separate a proton from a nucleus. Okay. So you see that proton separation energies also show some peaks at certain locations, and um, just as we saw in the previous case, there are some sudden jumps in the proton separation energies at certain locations. Some sudden jumps, and these sudden jumps occur at certain particular values. Some particular values you see some sudden peaks appearing here, this location. So, where are these, at what number of protons are these peaks appearing? When we, at what nucleon number are such peaks appearing? When that was noted, it was found that at a nucleon number of 8, at a nucleon number of 20, 28, 50, 82. But when the proton numbers happen to be, because in this case we are taking isotones. Isotones means neutron number is the same. So when neutron number is the same, the variable number would be the proton number. So at the locations where proton number is 8, proton number is 20, proton number is 28, 50, 82, etc., we see that there are peaks in the graph of proton separation energy. Similarly, you have a plot of neutron separation energy. And neutron separation energy has been measured in the case of isotopes, I think. Yeah. Isotopes means proton number is a constant and neutron number is a variable, isn't it? Isotones are nuclei where isotones are where nuclei with same neutron number, and isotopes are nuclei with same proton number. Okay. That is why on the x-axis you have been just given nucleon number. Because for this graph, you are looking at the proton number. The variable is proton number. And for this graph, the variable is neutron number. Okay. So you see that when neutron number hits certain particular values like 8, 20, 28, 50, 82, 126, etc., you see peaks in this graph also. So, just like the ionization energy graph that we saw here, we saw that at locations of shell closures, ionization energy was maximum. This is a similar observation here. Here you are plotting proton separation energy and neutron separation energy. You see that there are peaks appearing at certain occupation numbers. So when nucleon numbers take certain specific values, you see that there are peaks observed in the graph. So this might be locations of shell closures in the case of nucleons, just as we had shell closures in the case of atoms. Okay. But at locations of shell closures, you have some drastic variation in properties. Such a similar observation is observed in the case of proton and neutron separation energies of various nuclei. Now, you also have other experimental evidences, like when you consider the alpha decay, when you consider the radon, we see that for different isotopes of radon, you look at the energy of the particle that has been emitted. So here we have taken two isotopes of radon, and when the when we take an isotope where the neutron number is 126, when the neutron number is 126, we see that the energy of the alpha particle emitted is very high. Okay. For all other neutron numbers, there is no such observation. But when the neutron number is 126, the energy of the alpha particle emitted is very high. That is because this is again a stable configuration. This might be a stable configuration, and it will be a high binding energy configuration, and it will be very difficult to remove some particle out of that nucleus. And when such a particle comes out, it will carry large amount of energy. It may be because of that. So this is one another experimental observation that you see. The energy of the outgoing particle is very high when the neutron number is 126 in the case of alpha decay of radon isotopes. Now, this is a graph where neutron number has been plotted on the x-axis, and you have neutron absorption cross section. Okay, neutron capture cross section. Neutron capture cross section. Okay. So I will tell you. Here you have different nuclei. Different nuclei are shown here in this graph, and we will see that. Okay, what is in the y-axis? We will just see first, and then we will explain the graph. On the y-axis, I have plotted neutron capture cross section. So just imagine a situation where I have a target and I am shooting high energy neutron beams to the target. Okay, just imagine such a situation. Scattering can occur, and another possibility of occurrence is some of these neutrons can be absorbed by the nuclei in the target. Such things can also happen. Okay, and they will undergo some other process. Say sometimes they may undergo some other nuclear reactions also. Such a thing can happen. And when you are shooting such high energy neutron beam, the neutron capture cross section just means the probability of the neutron being captured by the target atoms, target nuclei. The probability that the incoming neutrons are absorbed or captured by the nuclei present in the target. That is what we have plotted here. And you see different capture cross section values plotted here for various nuclei. And when neutron number is 28, you see that the capture cross section falls. When neutron number is 50, again you see capture cross section falls. See, this is your graph's nature. This is the general way in which your graph is moving. When it becomes 28, there is a dip in the capture cross section. When it becomes 50, there is again a dip in the capture cross section. When it is 80, again there is a dip. And when it is 126, again there is a dip in the capture cross section. So you just imagine you are given, say, 10 seats for accommodating persons, and if all the, okay, some 7 seats or whatever, you can accommodate 7 people in each of these seats. If there is a vacancy in any one or two of these seats, and if people are coming, there is a possibility of absorbing them in that seats. But if all the seats are completely filled, then when a person comes, when an eighth person comes here, there is no possibility of, the probability of accommodating that person also is actually very low, because there is no option to accommodate that person. That is what happens here. At locations of shell closures, the shell is actually completely filled, and there is no possibility to accommodate a neutron if it is absorbed. So that is why at certain locations or certain neutron numbers, the absorption or the capture cross section falls drastically. But for the others, there is a possibility to accommodate the absorbed neutron because there is vacancy in their nuclear shells. So these are evidences which strongly suggest that shell model can be proposed in the case of nuclei. So if you go through your textbook, you can see several such experimental proofs which strongly suggest that shell model is not a very bad model to be proposed in the case of nuclei, and it can explain actually various properties of the nuclei also. Now, in order to develop the shell model, what we first of all require is an apt potential, and using that potential we solve Schrodinger equation, and we arrive at different energy levels possible. That is what we do. And one of the very familiar potentials for us is infinite well potential. And if we assume the infinite well potential and also the harmonic oscillator potential, these are two infinite potentials that we are very familiar with, and we have used it in many other cases also. Uh, when you have studied your quantum mechanics course, you might have seen you have made use of both these type of potentials for various problems. And if we assume the same known potential, infinite well potential as well as harmonic oscillator potential, and solve Schrodinger equation, you arrive at a specific scheme of energy levels. We know that energy is quantized and it is not continuous. So you obtain a specific set of energy levels, and you obtain energy gaps between them also. So for a choice of infinite well potential, these are the energy levels that you obtain. And for a choice of harmonic oscillator potential, for a harmonic oscillator potential, we know that energy levels are equispaced. That we know. For a harmonic oscillator, the energy levels are equispaced, and we know that the 0 point energy level has an energy of 3 by 2 h cross omega for a three-dimensional harmonic oscillator. Okay. And each energy level is separated at h cross omega from the ground level. That we know. But uh, in the case of infinite well potential, of course, the energy levels are not equispaced, but there are gaps between energy levels. And if you look at the filling, here also you take some results from atomic physics. You see that the energy levels are named as 1s, 1p, 1d, etc. You might be thinking, in atomic spectroscopy, we never had a notation like 1p, 1d, etc. Here the 1 is not principal quantum number. In atomic spectroscopy, if you remember, n was principal quantum number which can take values n equal to 1, 2, 3, etc. And L had a restriction that it can take values only 0, 1, 2, 3, etc. up to n minus 1. Sorry. Here the n that we are talking about number which indicates this is not the principal quantum number. It just tells you it is the state, first lowest energy state. It is the second state corresponding to the quantum. This is not a principal quantum number. It just you may just 1D means the first lowest D state, 2D means the second D state, 3D means the third D state, etc. Okay, this is just a number that arises from solving the equation, but it has no connection to principal quantum number. That is why you have 1p state, 1d state, etc. Okay, so this is the scheme of energy levels that arise out of infinite well potential, and here filling how much each subshell can accommodate. That is actually given by 2 into 12 plus 1, as we did for atomic spectroscopy. So, as per that, your S shell, for which your L equal to 0, can accommodate 2 into, which means 2 nucleons. Okay, it can accommodate 2 particles. Then your P shell for L equal to 1, it can accommodate 6. Then D can accommodate 10. That is same as in atomic spectroscopy, but this 1, 2, 3, etc., they are not your principal quantum numbers. This is true here also. For harmonic oscillator potential also, it is also an infinite potential. Here also, these numbers don't indicate your principal quantum number. Okay, that is one factor. It just simply counts the number of levels which have that particular L value. Okay. And if you see, there are energy gaps at these locations where you have a double-ended arrow here. These are locations of energy gap. And if you see the number of electrons that can be accommodated in each shell have been given here on the right hand side. As we said before, S can accommodate 2, P can accommodate 6, and D can accommodate 10. That has been shown here in the right corner of each energy level. And here in the circled numbers, those are the cumulative number of nucleons which have been filled up to this portion. So, I will tell you, after we finish the first shell, we have an energy gap. The number of nucleons filled till then are 2. So, the cumulative number of nucleons filled till that energy gap are 2. Now, in the next shell, I can accommodate 6 electrons. And when we reach the next gap, the total number of nucleons filled till then will be 2 plus 6, which gives me 8. Then after this, I have a new energy level coming, which can accommodate 10. Another energy level 2s coming, which can accommodate 2. Then I have an energy gap. So by the time I reach the third gap, I would have filled 2 plus 6 plus 10 plus 2 nucleons, which is 20 nucleons. Okay. And by the time I reach the fourth gap, I would have filled 34. So these are the cumulative number of nucleons which I fill as I reach every energy gap. But you see these numbers. So these should be locations of shell closures, isn't it? So after 2, I have a shell closure. That is fine. After 8, again, I have a shell closure. That is also fine. After 20, I have a shell closure. That is also okay. But then you see the next number. It is 34 here. But our magic numbers were not like this. It was like this. These are called magic numbers because these occupation numbers indicate extra stability, and at these locations properties show very drastic variations, and these are expected to be locations of nuclear shell closures. So when we are proposing some potential, that potential should be able to generate an energy level scheme such that shell closures should occur at these particular values. But we see that the infinite well potential is able to generate a set of energy levels, but it is not able to satisfactorily explain the magic numbers. Beyond 20, the obtained shell closure locations are wrong. As per our experimental observations, we should obtain shell closures at these locations. So, we should be able to propose a potential which can produce an energy level scheme such that energy gaps occur after filling these many cumulative number of nucleons. After 2 nucleons, I should have a gap. After 8, I should have a gap. After 20, I should have an energy gap. After 28, a gap should be there. 50, after 50, a gap should be there. So I should be able to generate an energy level scheme which generates gaps at these locations. But I see that Infinite Well fails to do so. So this is not a suitable choice of potential. Now, if we go to the harmonic oscillator scheme, we see that there are several energies with several levels with the same energies. That's why we have plotted it like this. 1D, 2S have the same energies. 1F, 2P, again the same energies, etc. And if we look at the cumulative number of nucleons that are accommodated, for the one is shell, 2 nucleons, then an energy gap, then we have a 1p level where we can accommodate 6 nucleons. And after filling 8 nucleons, you see that there are a gap. 2 plus 6, 8 nucleons cumulative. You see that we arrive at another gap. And the third level, it is actually 1D and 2S. 1D can accommodate 10, 2S can accommodate 2. So by the time you fill 2 plus 6 plus 2 plus 12, that is 20 nucleons, you see a gap. Then you see that from here on, the gaps are observed at some different nucleon numbers which are not matching with these numbers. So, again, you are obtaining an energy level scheme that is true, but you are not obtaining the energy level scheme as was obtained from experiments. So, this is also not a suitable choice of potential. And moreover, one problem in choosing such potentials, infinite well as well as harmonic oscillator potential, is that both are infinite potentials. But we know that we need not supply infinite amount of energy to separate a nucleon from the nucleus. We saw just before in the graph that we need to supply large amount of energy, but we need not supply infinite amount of energy to bring a nucleon out of the nucleus. The energies are finite. So choice of an infinite potential is actually not suitable. It's not a realistic choice in the case of nuclei. So if we just improve our model by choosing a realistic potential this time, we are choosing a potential of this format. I don't know if you remember a similar sort of an equation you had seen in the case of nuclear density, where your nuclear density started from a maximum value and then it gradually fell like this. We had plotted such a graph for nuclear density. I don't know if you remember this graph. This is actually the exact opposite of that graph because you are considering a potential well, so it has to be a depth. And the potential nuclear actually charge distribution, if you remember, nucleus does not have a definite boundary. Actually, it's a faded boundary. Suddenly, your charge density is not stopping like this at some particular value of r. It is actually only gradually falling down. Okay. So you should assume a potential which does not have an abrupt boundary, but its boundary is actually tapered. You This is a very realistic form of a nuclear potential that we can assume. And such a potential is called Woods-Saxon potential. Such a potential is called Woods-Saxon potential. And if you assume such a potential and if you try to solve Schrodinger equation and obtain the energy level scheme, we thought it would be slightly better. And this is how the energy scheme appears to be. Here also you see that you are obtaining certain numbers, but again, you are not actually properly able to generate the magic numbers. See here you have been given two sets of numbers. One set is the number of nucleons that shell, each subshell can accommodate. One S can accommodate 2, P can accommodate 6, D can accommodate 10, etc. And the second set of numbers are the cumulative number of nucleons. After the first shell, there is a gap. By then, you would have filled two nucleons. After the second shell, again, you have a gap. By then, you would have filled 2 plus 6, 8 nucleons. Then, the third, you have two closely lying energy levels, and the gap is appearing after you fill 20 nucleons, etc. So, you see that actually the magic numbers have not been properly generated, even when we assume reasonable potential. So actually, it is not fully with the choice of a finite potential or infinite potential. There has to be some other assumption too, which can bring in the magic numbers properly. And this is where you come up with the assumption of something called a spin orbit potential, which we will deal with in the next class. Okay. So even when you assume such a realistic potential, you are not able to generate the magic numbers properly. So the problem is not just with the choice of the potential. There has to be some other concept too here, which facilitates the rearrangement of energy levels or which facilitates in generation of the energy gaps properly so that you can explain the occurrence of magic numbers. And we bring in the concept of something called spin orbit interaction, which we studied in the case of atomic spectroscopy to the case of nuclei too. And that with that we can successfully explain the occurrence of magic numbers. Okay, that we will see in the next class.